Good morning from New Jersey. Good afternoon to all of you. I am now home and recovered from the jet lag from my trip down to South Africa last week, where I had three wonderful get-togethers in Joburg, Durban, and Cape Town, and had a chance to enjoy your company, enjoy your country, and give the presentation I'm about to give 3 times. It's really exciting that we have now expanded the Infinite Dial to South Africa. A couple things real quick before we get going. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that any of you have. If you do have questions, you can put them into the chat box, and then when I finish this presentation, I'll take a look, and if there's anything there, I'm happy to try to answer that. Also, this deck will be available. It'll be on the Edison website at edisonresearch.com, and I believe it'll also be distributed by the NAB soon after the completion of this webinar. So if anyone wants to get the deck, they will be able to. And finally, before I get going, I do want to thank all the people involved in making this happen. The NAB of South Africa has been really the key to this whole thing, and that committee, all the people who worked on this from the NAB and their research committee were incredibly great, and the drivers of bringing this international study to your country. And we have to thank the sponsor of this study, which is Triton Digital, a company that many of you may know. That provides services to digital audio throughout the world, and they've been very generous to sponsor Infinite Dial in many countries around the world. And they're a key and wonderful partner to us here at Edison, and a partner to many of you guys and many broadcasters and people involved in podcasting, streaming, etc., around the world. So thank you to Triton for their support of this effort and bringing this knowledge to the world and now to South Africa. So the Infinite Dial, as some of you will know, is this study that we do. It's a high quality survey of the population. What we've done here in South Africa is a little different from, for those of you familiar with the ones we've done in other countries, a little bit different. I'll go through those differences, but basically it is designed to allow us to compare the data we see in South Africa to the data we see in other countries. So with regard to what we're doing here, if I can forward the slide, there we go. So the Infinite Dial has been going on since 1998, an annual survey in the United States, where we've been tracking lots of things that you'll see the data from today. And we've done a very similar process here in South Africa to create comparisons between what we see in the United States and South Africa, as well as other countries, as you'll see in this presentation. So the survey was done, and I should also thank Nielsen, which was the data collection partner for this project in South Africa. We did a survey of 1,500 people, ages 15 and older. It's done to the highest research standards in terms of reflecting the population that we have here. But it's important that I make the point that it's not a survey of the full population of South Africa. And in the middle paragraph that you can see on the screen there, you can see what it is reflective of. People living in the major metro areas, the 3 major metro areas of Gauteng, Durban, and Cape Town, and covering the upper 2 of the 3 SEM supergroups, as you see there. And we are referring to this in the presentation and everything we're putting out as the major metro commercial population of South Africa. It represents approximately 21% of your total population. So that's important because there will be graphs that compare your numbers to 4 other countries: USA, Canada, Australia, and Germany. And in the 4 other countries, it is a survey of the total populations. Here we're looking at the group, as I just described, that 21% of South Africans. But within that 21%, all the procedures were put in place to create a very high quality survey and very high quality estimates of what that 21% of the South African population looks like. So let's start by just looking at some devices and technologies. And first, we have our estimate of how many people own a smartphone within the major metro commercial population in South Africa. And we got a very, very high percentage. 88% of the major market commercial population in South Africa owns a smart phone. And you see those numbers are really, really high among young people, 15 to 34, it's 93%, almost as high as it can go. And even 55 plus, 3 out of every 4 South Africans within this population have a smartphone. So very, very high numbers. In fact, those numbers are higher than we see for the US population. Our most recent estimate from this year in the USA is 84% of the USA population, 15 plus, has a smartphone, and that compares to the higher number here in South Africa at 88%. Now, remember that 88% that I'm showing on the right-hand side of the screen here for a second, as I flip to this next graph where I'm going to do everything I can to confuse you a bit, but once we get past this graph and I explain it, it all should be clear from here. So I just said it was 88%. Why on this graph does it say 87% for South Africa? And that is, we want to compare these numbers across all 5 countries now that we're doing the survey in, which now includes Germany, Canada, and Australia. And the only age group that's the same across all 5 of the countries is 18 plus. Canada being the issue here. They have rules and regulations that make it extremely difficult to research teenagers. And so the Canadian survey is 18 plus. So to put everyone on the same scale here, we've reconfigured this graph to 18 plus. So whenever I'm showing all 5 countries, the data is not 15 plus like it is on all the other graphs, but 18 plus, and that's why it goes from 88 to 87% for South Africa. So clearing that out of the way, you see that within your major metro commercial population, now 18 plus, your numbers look just like these other 4 countries where we've done the infinite dial, and in fact, they're to the high end, only Australia with a higher estimate for people owning smartphones. The 2 hot topics right now in the world of audio are smart speakers and podcasting. We have a whole long section about podcasts coming up later in this presentation. Smart speakers really just getting going here are down in South Africa. We asked about all the brands within the smart speaker space, Amazon Alexa, Google Home, etc. And awareness, just mere awareness, have you ever heard of these things, is really quite modest in South Africa. Only about a quarter of people have ever even heard of them. And you can see that how that compares to the other 4 countries. So the good thing here is we have a baseline. The goal and idea is that Infinite Dial South Africa will be repeated, ideally, regularly, perhaps in a year, perhaps in 2 years, and then every year or every other year after that. And so we now have a baseline, and as smart speakers like Amazon's Alexa and Google Home, Apple HomePod, etc., as those are distributed and marketed in South Africa, this will be a really interesting one to track. But you do see awareness of these categories is significantly higher in these other countries as compared to in South Africa. Next, we look at broadcast radio, AM, FM radio. First, we just said, have you listened to broadcast radio in the last week? And we got 68% of everyone 15 and older who said yes, they have. Robust numbers across the board. It does tilt older as it does in pretty much every country. And one thing that is interesting about that estimate is it's actually exactly the same number that we see in the United States. So in our US survey, 68% said they've listened to radio in the last week. Within the major metro commercial population of South Africa, exactly the same, 68%. And you also see that number is quite similar to what we see in these other countries, with the, now looking 18 plus, with the outlier being Australia, which is doubtlessly the strongest broadcast radio market in the world. Very, very strong commercial sector, very strong public sector, et cetera, and other factors involved as to why that number is so high. But you see that the South African estimate, right in line with what our estimates are within these other countries. So broadcast radio with a very high, competitively high percentage there. We also asked an interesting question in South Africa, which is, do you ever listen to radio, broadcast radio content at home on a non-radio device, meaning over your phone, through your computer, or especially importantly in South Africa, through your television, where many of the radio stations are available through cable systems, et cetera. And to me, from my perspective, a very high percentage, 44%, of South Africans saying that they do listen to radio at home using something other than a radio to get it done. And interesting here, it tilts younger. So younger people, perhaps using technology or using their televisions, much more likely to listen to radio at home, not using a radio, but using something else. The only country where we asked a similar question is Australia, and you see the percentage of people using other devices to listen to radio much higher in South Africa as compared to what we see in Australia. The next thing we looked at is music discovery. First, we said, how important is it to you to keep up to date with music? 42% very important, 33% somewhat important, 25% not at all important. Many people watching this webinar are going to be involved in broadcast radio or online audio or things like that, and living and working in a world probably where everyone considers music and music discovery very important. So it's always interesting, I think, for people to see that how many people aren't as compelled, aren't living their lives worrying about keeping up to date with music in the way that people who work in that realm do. Regardless of how important keeping up to date to music is, we ask people, where do you go to learn about music? And the clear majority of everyone said radio is where they go to learn about music in South Africa. And that number is way higher than we see in other countries. So radio is still very much where South Africans are going to learn about to learn about music. And that'll be an interesting one to track over time as well. So online audio is, and measurement of online audio has sort of always been a bit of the backbone of the infinite dial study. If you go back to the origins, back in the late 90s, it was about this idea of the internet as a way to consume audio and watching that develop over time. So let's look at what metrics we found in South Africa for that. So this is sort of a roll-up question. Have you consumed audio online in the last month? And so this would be doing it anyway, listening to streams of broadcast radio, listening to pure plays, such as Spotify or Apple Music or something like that, listening basically to any kind of audio using the internet. Our estimate is 39% of South Africans, major metro commercial South Africans, have indeed used online audio in the month before we called them. With, as I would think comes, there's no surprise to anybody, a very strong tilt to younger people being more likely to do that. This graph takes on some real color though when we compare it to our American estimates, where we have to go back basically 7 years, just under 7 years to get back to where our estimate in the United States for people listening, using online audio were as compared to the numbers in South Africa. Now, there's any number of reasons or explanations. This was a strong area of discussion in my visits down there as to why this might be. I'm sure there's all manner of explanations, but one of them clearly is something I talked about down there, which came as a surprise to some people, which is in the United States, most people who have smartphones have unlimited data plans, or data plans that are so generous that they are functionally unlimited. They wouldn't know how to use all their data allotment, even if they tried. So for someone to start streaming Spotify or Pandora, which is a big brand here, or the stream of a broadcast radio station, or really anything, live, streaming a podcast as opposed to downloading it through Wi-Fi, et cetera. Many people in the United States are going to do that literally without thinking about it, without any consciousness of data usage or fear of going over their limit or having to pay extra, et cetera. I've come to learn that that is very much not the case in South Africa, where most people are on limited data plans and are very cautious about using their data. And so that's almost assuredly one of the reasons. And I'm sure there's content-based reasons as well, probably just more and better developed products that have been marketed more aggressively. As a result, you see those numbers growing year on year in the United States and well out ahead of our estimate for the major metro commercial population of South Africa. And in this case, you can see that by comparison to Canada, Australia, and the USA, the South African estimate is way behind. It's actually similar to Germany. And similarly, while I was down there, many people were surprised to learn that in Germany, a country obviously that's very, very developed economy, and the biggest economy in Europe, they actually have many of the same obstacles or situations that we see in South Africa. They are almost all on limited data plans on their phones, so as conscious of these issues as South Africans are, as well as they have famously bad at-home internet service, incredibly slow and poor and unavailable in various parts of Germany, from what we've come to learn. And so as a result, they have not maybe picked up some of these behaviors at quite the same pace, but as we see in these other developed countries. So that's monthly. Have you done in the last month? We also looked at, have you consumed any online audio in the last week? So it was 39% for the last month, 32% for the last week. So you do see that the ratio of, if you do it at all in the last month, you're very likely to also say you've done it in the last week with some regularity. So that ratio is relatively high. And again, we see this younger tilt, which we would expect. Here, that estimate is exactly the same as what we got 6 years ago in the United States. So again, this survey acts as a baseline. It'll be really interesting to see, does South Africa track at the same pace, 6 years behind? Does South Africa close the gap? I am loath to make predictions because there's so many variables involved, but it will be interesting to see if and when South Africa follows a similar pattern to what we see in the United States. And again, comparison now to the other 4 countries, and here you fall a little bit farther behind Germany, but well behind the other 3 English-speaking countries in our international surveys. Of course, the car is a super important location for audio consumption. So we have various questions where we look at the car. First, we said, just what do you use in your car? This was among anyone in our population who also has driven or ridden in a car in the last month, which is most people. 2/3 said radio. Many people were surprised by the next finding that half of people said they use the CD player in their car. Yes, CDs are sort of phasing out for a lot of people, but the average car on the road in the United States is 11 years old. I think it's similar in South Africa, and maybe a little bit newer, but nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of those cars on the road in South Africa have CD players in them. And so the idea that half of people use those CD players, to me, isn't that surprising. 1/3 of people say they've ever listened to they currently listen to their own digital music, presumably through their phones, maybe through a USB stick or something like that, and relatively small percentages for online audio and podcasts. This one also is interesting when we compare it to the American numbers. Radio usage higher in America, CD similar, but the last 3 much higher in the United States than in South Africa. Now, the last 3 basically are mostly or entirely done through phones in most cases. And so again, you just see that Americans are clearly more likely and more willing to plug in their phone using an auxiliary cable, using Bluetooth, however they might do it, than to date people in South Africa. And again, these ones will be interesting to track to see as technology develops, et cetera, if those numbers in South Africa converge towards the American numbers or not. Again, I already covered that Americans typically have very, very generous or unlimited data plans. So pulling out your phone and connecting it to the internet while driving. It's something Americans are clearly less shy about. We've done an interesting study about all the ways that people might listen to, in particular, music in their cars. And I don't know necessarily how often this happens down there. I definitely heard that people said it's similar in certain cases. People will bring little speakers into their car. They'll listen through the little speakers on their phone, which is kind of mind-boggling because the sound quality is so poor. And here in the States, we've even picked up somewhat horrifyingly people who will freely admit that while they drive, they will put earbuds in their ears or even like noise-canceling headphones over their ears while driving and then consuming music, which is scary. I certainly have seen it. At times I'll honk my horn at a stoplight or something to see if they can even tell that I've honked my horn, and in many cases they can't. But I guess it does say something about how committed to consuming audio people might be, that they will drive in such a dangerous fashion, doing all of that. When we asked what you use the most often in your car in South Africa, pretty split, but the biggest answer by far is radio. 45% of people saying radio is what they use most in their cars, but sizable chunks of people saying CDs or their digital files while driving in their cars. We also asked this question about, have you ever listened to online audio in a car through mobile phone? And 15% of South Africans said they've ever done that. And in this case, that's something that's somewhat similar to what we see in the United States, only a little bit more than a year and a half or so behind our estimate in the United States. So there are people, I'm confusing myself. This is, do you have an in-dash information? So this one, sorry, let me go back. There's 15% have ever listened to online audio in their car through a mobile phone. This is a different question. Do you have an in-dash information or entertainment system in your car? And this is where you're only a year or so behind the United States. 13% saying yes, they have one of these systems in their car, as compared to 19% of the states for having one of these integrated systems in their cars. So that's something that obviously is something interesting to track as we get a sense for how that might change. So I said earlier that the two hottest topics right now in the world of audio are smart speakers and podcasting. So we have now a long section about podcasting to look at where that stands in South Africa. So first, we just asked about awareness of the term podcasting. Have you ever heard that term before? Do you know that word, podcasting? And 22% of people in South Africa said yes, they've heard that word. So relatively modest percentage, and you'll see how modest that is when we compare it to what we get in the United States, where we've been asking this question now for many, many years. And in fact, our estimate for awareness of the word podcasting is lower than the first time we ever asked the question in 2006 in our surveys by 1 point. So it's basically where the numbers were in the United States 13 years ago in terms of awareness of this idea. And I do want people interested in podcasting to take a look at the US data and sort of the historical data there, because you can see the number got stuck in the 40s for many, many years as we trended it. And it's really taken off in a hurry over the last 4 or 5 studies that we've done. And so again, with this study as a baseline, and podcasting clearly a relatively new and just very early stages of development in South Africa, I really think it'll be a great resource to all of you to be able to compare it to the uptake of podcasting in the United States, and see if you see some of that acceleration perhaps that we have seen in the United States, especially over the last few years. Here's how that number compares to the other countries. And you see the countries where the overwhelming majority of people speak English in their homes: Canada, Australia, and the United States. The awareness of the term podcasting is very, very high. Of course, there's just so much English language content available. So that's clearly a huge factor in why there's so much uptake in those countries. The one country that the data is more similar is Germany. And to date, there hasn't been that much German language podcast content available. There is now dramatic investment and interest in podcasting in German and in Germany. And so that will also be an interesting one to track going forward and see how that one develops. You see it's relatively low in South Africa in terms of awareness by comparison to what we see in these other countries. Despite awareness of the term podcasting being low, when we describe podcasting and ask people if they've ever listened to a podcast, a relatively high percentage of that said yes. So 19% of South Africans said they've ever listened to a podcast, including a quarter of young South Africans, 15 to 34-year-olds. This number again, though, however, tracking way behind our estimates in the United States, between 10 and 11 years behind. And again, you see that pattern in the United States where it's kind of been growing all along, but really growing at a more accelerated clip over the last 4 or 5 studies. And it'll be interesting again to see how those numbers might compare in South Africa to what we see in the US, and for that matter, in these other countries where have you ever listened to a podcast once we sort of describe what they were, and our estimate for South Africa well behind what we see in these other countries. We also have an estimate of monthly listening. So the first one was, have you ever listened? This is, have you listened to a podcast in the last month? And our estimate is 10% of South Africans have listened to a podcast in the last month. And that, again, is between 10 and 11 years behind our estimates for the United States. So it's, just on the board there, and one that'll be interesting to see tracked. And notice, by the way, the huge leap that we saw year on year in the United States for podcast consumption in the last year, where there's been tons of new launches in the space, most importantly, tons of advertising and promotion for podcasts. If you come visit us here in the States, you are apt to see television promotions or straight up commercials for podcasts. You might see a billboard for podcasts. You'll certainly see plenty of digital advertising for podcasts. It's a red hot sort of little sector of the media right now, and it's getting lots of marketing investment, and that's pushing consumption, as you can see on this graph as well. And again, early days for podcasting in South Africa, but 10% of people saying they've listened to the last month, relatively small compared to the other countries where we looked at. One thing that you might notice is that while the awareness of podcasting was much higher in Australia, the consumption of podcasting is actually lower in Australia. This is something we've done the Australian study now 3 times, and it's been true in all 3 of their surveys. We think that's likely because broadcast radio talks about podcasting all the time, but it's really been defined for Australians almost entirely as catch-up radio. And did you miss this radio show? Now you can, listen to the podcast version of it. Similar to what I've been describing in other countries, there's now a ton of investment going on in creating native content to Australia, in their accent, talking about the topics they're interested in, of bespoke podcasts that aren't just catch-up radio. So it'll be interesting to see if the Australian numbers catch up. And then similarly, as investment comes into the South African space, as there are more podcasts in all of your languages, and more importantly, in my opinion, talking about the things that South Africans talk about, that they care about, that they're interested in, that I think will be the key for developing podcasting in South Africa. While there's amazing content being created throughout the globe, and within this population, a huge percentage speak English, until or unless there is South African content made by and for South Africans, I doubt that the numbers here will catch up very dramatically. So 10% of South Africans said they've listened to a podcast in the last month. We can then look at who they are and what they're all about. As we've seen in other countries as well, especially when it first gets going, the monthly podcast consumer in South Africa is more male, 59% compared to the population essentially being equal. This is probably a combination of, we've seen typically that things that are techier tend to be more male, at least in the early stages. And there could certainly be a content explanation as well. Perhaps more of the content that is available for people is for men. And that's why it's among the relatively small number of people, it's developing a little bit faster among men. Interestingly, this group is no different in terms of age, exactly the same age profile for people who said they've listened to a podcast in the last month as the population in in total of the major metro commercial population. They are, however, higher income, which is what we see in other countries as well. So you know, their monthly household income is higher, as well as the level of education is higher. As you can see on the right-hand side of this graph, the people with some university or university degree are much higher among the people who consume podcasts as among the total population. So if podcasting is in South Africa is a space that you're interested in, and you're interested in a model that is based on ad sales, for now, it's a very attractive, while small, it's a very attractive audience for ad sales, high income, high education, and you know, so a story that I think could be told to advertisers that might be somewhat compelling. If people said they listened to a podcast in the last week in South Africa, they listened to a nice number, 4 on average, a little lower than we see in the United States, but still, once people start listening, they often listen to a lot, and you can see there we have 16% saying 6 or more. You know, again, if people do listen, many of them will listen to a bunch of different podcasts. A few other items on podcasting. No surprise, but a good thing to look at. Mostly it's being done on the smartphone or other mobile device. As we see in other countries, and sometimes surprising people in the podcasting space, most people say the place they listen to podcasts is at home. 3/4 of podcast listeners say that they, who've ever listened to podcasts, say they listen at home. And yes, percentages of people saying they listen in other places, including 4th down the list, and me trying to say this caused great entertainment value for people in my 3 live presentations, so I'll do it for you guys as well. In a car, bakkie, or truck. And yes, this is the first time the word bakkie has made it into any of Edison Research's surveys. But in terms of where people said they listen mostly, it's mostly at home. And again, this surprises some people in the podcasting space who think, oh, it's going to be in the car, or it's going to be people walking around, et cetera. But I always try to remind people that people spend most of their time at home. And it's a time for this kind of consumption. No one would be surprised to learn that most people's television is consumption is mostly at home. And in some ways, podcasting is more similar to TV than it is to broadcast radio. Because it's something typically people want to pay attention to and concentrate and lean in on, as the sort of pop phrase goes. And as such, people have that kind of space available in their lives at home. So while it's no longer a surprise to me, I know that this does still surprise people in the podcasting space, how much of this consumption is at home. For South Africans who have consumed podcasts, I think a lot of that is what I described in Australia, being defined as catch-up radio. Did you miss the show this morning? You can listen to it as a podcast. And that's in part here. We asked, when you listen to a podcast, how much do you typically listen to? And while a majority said the entire podcast or most of the podcast, surprising numbers of people said, you know, not as much. And again, that gives me the sense that it's largely being consumed as catch-up radio, where you might not feel as compelled to listen to the whole thing. You know, so many of the great podcasts that are bespoke podcasts really have a story behind them, or a real arc, a beginning, middle, and end. And as those become more part of the picture in South Africa, perhaps the percentage saying they listen to all or most of the podcasts will increase. You can also see it a bit here, where this really surprised me to the high side. We asked people who've listened to podcasts, they listen to podcasts by South African radio stations or radio personalities, and 3 out of 5 said yes. So there's nothing wrong about this, of course, and it's great that the radio industry is pushing podcasting forward, as frankly, American broadcasters are belatedly doing here in the United States. But again, I don't think you'll see the full flower of podcasting until there's both catch-up radio, podcasts being created by radio personalities, and bespoke podcasts, things made as podcasts because it is a slightly different form of media, and you know, making a podcast as a podcast is slightly different from repurposing a radio show as a podcast. So again, those will all be interesting things to track as we go forward in South Africa. Lastly, we have a section on social media, and it's certainly interesting to see what it looks like in South Africa and how it compares to the United States. Sort of a cousin in terms of digital media, not as centered on the audio space. So do you use social media? A very high percentage of South Africans in your major metro commercial population saying yes, 82%, including nearly everybody 15 to 34, and now half of people 55 plus in South Africa saying they use social media in some fashion. That number right in line with what we see in the 3 other countries where we ask this. We don't ask this in Canada, but you see very similar to what we see in the other 3 countries where we have this measurement. So what are people using in South Africa? Well, far and away, the leader is WhatsApp. 79% of South Africans using WhatsApp, 2 out of 3 using Facebook, 64%, Instagram, Twitter, and on down the list. I always like to call out Twitter on this list because the people attending this webinar, the people who went to the live presentations when I was there last week, excuse me, they're all in the media. And in the media world, everyone uses Twitter, and everyone uses Twitter all the time. And it's hard to imagine a world where people don't use Twitter. And as I like to point out, this shows that media people are not normal people because lot fewer people in the general population using Twitter as compared to the people working media, advertising, marketing, et cetera, where those numbers would be way, way higher. These numbers also get pretty interesting when we compare them to the American numbers. Many South Africans are surprised to see how low, how modest the numbers are for WhatsApp in the United States by comparison to what they are in South Africa. Americans all, I think literally every single cell phone or mobile package you can possibly get includes unlimited texts, literally unlimited. You could send 1 million of them and you would pay the same. So I think texting is so used in the United States that the need for WhatsApp as a messaging service to get around texting costs just hasn't really developed here. If you look at the 19% of Americans who do use WhatsApp, it's largely people who have family in other countries where WhatsApp is heavily used. And so they're communicating outside of the USA using WhatsApp. The Facebook number, exactly the same in both countries. And then all of the other, well, Twitter the same in both countries, and then the others much higher in the United States than in South Africa to date. And that will be one that's interesting to watch. We also asked, what's the one that you use the most? And you see that overwhelmingly it's WhatsApp, even among young people. Among these, which one do you use the most? It's WhatsApp. These numbers, again, wildly different from what we see in the United States, and especially among young people in the United States, where it's all about Instagram and Snapchat, which have very, very small percentages in South Africa by comparison, because of, I guess, the dominance of WhatsApp and what people are using. So just a few things to think about and conclude on. As you see, radio usage is high in South Africa, in cars and in general. The whole sort of reason for being of this survey that the audio space is dynamic, lots of things coming in, new forms of audio being used on many devices, especially phones. And again, I think it's so interesting to have a baseline for all these numbers, to see where digital audio is, to see where audio is, and to watch it as all these forces and new technologies and new platforms and ideas, et cetera, develop. You kind of have a sense for where you stand and where you are, and something that you can track going forward. As we saw, the digital audio market here lags several years behind the United States and the other countries on most of the measures we looked at, podcasting being one, really just getting off the ground in South Africa, but the audience that does exist to date is highly educated, higher income, so attractive to advertisers. And people ask me to predict what's going to happen in the future, and I don't know for sure, but I think it's a fair guess. I think I would put my money down on digital audio growing and perhaps growing rapidly. The technology is sort of in place there. It's really just factors that it's holding it back, especially the cost of data, both at home and on your phones. If those costs change, and if over time the sort of cost-benefit ratio starts to change there, I think it'll free up a lot of people to sort of explore all the things that can be done with digital audio that maybe they're a bit shy about for now. And if you do think that digital audio will grow and start to catch up to some of these numbers we see in these other countries, it obviously creates tremendous opportunities for players in the space or outside entrants, and to make that transition happen. And I looked at the list of people attending this webinar, and I see there's people, not just South Africans, tapping in here. And of course, South Africa is in itself really important developing market, but it also has tended to be the gateway to all of Africa. And so if one sees opportunity in South Africa, the opportunity in South Africa is significant, but has the potential to lead to yet more opportunity beyond. So all the reasons why South Africa is an exciting market on so many levels. So that's maybe not so quick spin, but a spin through a very comprehensive data set that, again, thank you to the NAB and the research committee there and Triton Digital for powering this thing forward. Any questions that came in?
I didn't see any yet.
Okay, no questions came in. We are happily available. You can send them. You can contact us through Twitter. We're at Edison Research, or use the hashtag Infinite Dial. You can email us at info@edisonresearch.com if you want more information. And we're happy to keep the discussion going. And in short order, this deck will be on the Edison website, and I believe the NAB will be making it available through their means as well. So with that, I'll thank everyone for tuning in. And I want to say again, thanks to everyone who, while I was down there, offered such warm and wonderful hospitality. And I look forward to visiting you down there again with future iterations and versions of the Infinite Dial South Africa. Have a good day, everybody.